Hollywood was built on light, but it has always been the darkness that writes its best stories. In the city of fame, the brave rarely live long. They were singers, actors, comedians, and dreamers, people whose only mistake was saying no to the wrong men. In an age when silence was safer than truth, these 10 refused to bow. And in Hollywood, defiance always comes with a price. The mob didn't just own the streets of Las Vegas or the back rooms of Chicago. It owned contracts. It owned careers. It owned fear. The studios and the syndicates had a silent handshake, one that traded safety for obedience. Those who accepted it became stars. Those who resisted became stories whispered in dressing rooms long after their deaths. They thought they were free. They thought talent could protect them. But in a town where money speaks louder than conscience, freedom was just another illusion sold on a studio lot. Some of these names you'll recognize. Legends who once smiled from magazine covers, their fame as bright as the spotlights that later burned them out. Others you've never heard of, because someone made sure of that. Their fates were written not by the public, not by critics, but by men who sat in smoke-filled rooms, deciding who lived, who fell, and who simply vanished. Sal Mineo, Joey Lewis, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, Phyllis McGuire. 5 stories of courage and 5 reminders that even the loudest voices can be silenced when they challenge the wrong gods. The first of them was a rebel, a young man who carried James Dean's fire, but none of his protection. He saw too much, spoke too honestly, and paid for it outside his own front door. His name was Sal Mineo, and his death was no accident. Sal Mineo, the rebel who knew too much. He was born with eyes that seemed to belong to someone twice his age, deep, alert, and quietly wounded. Sal Mineo never looked like he fit in, and maybe that was why the camera loved him. By the time he was 16, he was already a Broadway veteran. By 20, he was nominated for an Academy Award for Rebel Without a Cause. He didn't just act the role of a lost boy, he was one. Hollywood called him the next James Dean, but the town only loved its rebels when they stayed on the screen. Off camera, Sal was something the studios didn't know how to control. Outspoken, passionate, and unafraid to confront the truth behind the dream factory. In the 1960s, he started asking questions no one else dared to. Why did so many stars vanish without explanation? Why did union bosses, supposedly protecting artists, answer to men in Chicago instead of Los Angeles? Why did everyone in power seem afraid of someone else, someone unseen? It wasn't paranoia. Sal had begun seeing the underworld up close. Not in the streets, but in the shadows behind the lights. He was part of the underground circles that connected Hollywood's gay community. A secret world filled with fear, blackmail, and the quiet influence of organized crime. The mob saw opportunity where others saw shame. They controlled the bars, the parties, the silence. And Sal, brave or naive, refused to be silent. He spoke out about corruption in Hollywood unions and hinted that powerful men, some with mob ties, were exploiting vulnerable actors. Those words made him dangerous. By the early 1970s, his career was slipping. Studios stopped calling. His name vanished from the casting sheets. But still he talked. He told friends he was working on something big, a story about the darker side of fame, about people who were being used and thrown away. Then came February 12th, 1976. It was late when Sal finished rehearsing for his new play. He was tired but content, finally rebuilding his life on his own terms. He parked his car outside his apartment on Holloway Drive, West Hollywood. The street was quiet, the kind of silence that feels rehearsed. As he stepped out of the car, someone approached from behind. A flash of silver, a single motion, a blade plunged deep into his chest. Sal collapsed against his car, gasping for breath. When neighbors found him moments later, he was still alive, but barely. He whispered, "Oh God," before the world faded out. The police called it a random mugging, but nothing about it was random. His wallet was untouched, his watch still on his wrist. And the supposed mugger? A drifter with no ties, or so the official report claimed. For those who knew Sal, the truth was much colder. He had been warned to stop talking. He didn't. And in Hollywood, that's all it takes. After his death, a few people tried to keep his name alive, but the town moved on quickly. No one wanted to believe the mob still had reach in the 1970s, or that a young actor's death could be anything but coincidence. It was easier to call it tragic, not targeted. But Sal Mineo had seen behind the curtain. He had glimpsed the machine that ran the dream, and for that, he became one more forgotten casualty in the city of illusions. He once said in an interview, "You can't survive this business if you're too honest." He was right. And that honesty, the one thing that made him real, is what got him killed. Sal Mineo stood up to the darkness, and the darkness made sure he stayed silent. Joey Lewis, the comedian who wouldn't obey, long before the mob discovered Hollywood, it owned the nightclubs. And in those dim rooms full of smoke and jazz, Joey Lewis was a star. He wasn't just funny, he was magnetic. When Joe stepped on stage, gangsters stopped talking and women forgot to breathe. He could make the most dangerous men in Chicago laugh until they cried. That was his gift and his curse. By the late 1920s, Joe had become the crown jewel of the Green Mill Club, a mob-owned speakeasy run by Machine Gun Jack McGurn, one of Al Capone's most ruthless lieutenants. McGurn adored Joe. He saw him as property. And like all property in that world, Joe was expected to stay loyal. But Joe wanted freedom. He wanted to choose his own stage, his own audience, his own future. When a rival club offered him a better deal, Joe said yes and walked away. No one walked away from Jack McGurn. A week later, on a cold November morning in 1927, Joe returned to his hotel room after a show. The hallway was quiet, the air heavy with rain. As he reached for his door, he heard footsteps behind him. The men moved fast. They dragged him inside, beat him until his bones cracked, and then held him down. One of them whispered, "You should have stayed where you belonged." Then they cut his throat from ear to ear. He should have died that night. But somehow Joey Lewis lived. When the bellboy found him hours later, bleeding but breathing, he was rushed to the hospital. Doctors said he'd never speak again. The mob thought they'd silenced him forever. They were wrong. Months passed. Joe taught himself to talk again. One word at a time, each syllable a victory. His voice was rough, broken, scarred. But his sense of humor survived untouched. When he finally returned to the stage, the audience wept before he spoke a word. And when he did, the first thing he said was, "You should hear me sing." The room exploded in laughter. That was Joe, fearless even in the face of death. He refused to name his attackers, even when everyone knew who they were. Reporters asked why he stayed quiet. He just smiled and said, "I don't want to lose my sense of humor again." For years, he kept performing, often in mob-run clubs. He'd stand under the spotlight, making jokes about death, while the men who tried to kill him sat in the front row applauding. It was a strange kind of revenge, the laughter of a man who couldn't be broken. But the price of survival was isolation. Joe drank heavily, haunted by nightmares of that night. He never fully recovered, physically or emotionally. Still, he became a legend, the comedian who lived when the mob wanted him dead. Frank Sinatra later immortalized him in the 1957 film The Joker is Wild, playing Joe's story as both tragedy and triumph. When Sinatra asked Joe if the movie got it right, he said, "Almost. You forgot how scared I was." Joey Lewis died in 1971, alone in his apartment, a bottle of gin beside him. He had spent a lifetime making others laugh, but the sound never reached the place where the pain lived. Still, his defiance survived. In every punchline, every crooked smile, every night he stood under the lights, knowing the men who once tried to kill him were listening. He had learned the truth that so many others never did. You can survive the mob. You just can't escape it. Joey Lewis didn't just fight the mob, he humiliated them, one laugh at a time. Frank Sinatra, the voice who walked away. In the 1950s, Frank Sinatra was more than a singer. He was America's voice. That voice could command a room, charm presidents, and calm the chaos of a generation still healing from war. But beneath the spotlight, his story was never just about fame. It was about survival. in a world where every song had a price and every friend could be a trap. Sinatra was born into the noise of New Jersey, a street kid with ambition and attitude. He didn't come from money, he came from fight. And when fame found him, the mob was already waiting. In the 1940s and 1950s, no entertainer rose without a patron. And in Frank's case, that patron was Sam Giancana, the Chicago boss who ruled Las Vegas from behind the velvet curtains. Giancana loved Sinatra, his talent, his confidence, his connections. Through Giancana's influence, Sinatra got prime shows in mob-owned casinos, lucrative movie deals, and favored treatment from studio executives who owed the outfit more than they'd ever admit. For a while it worked. The mob had their voice, and Frank had his throne. He was untouchable, or so he thought. But Sinatra was no fool. He knew how power worked, and he didn't like being owned. Behind the charm and tuxedo was a man who understood that every favor came with a chain attached. It started small: requests for introductions, private meetings with politicians, whispers about certain campaign donations that needed to pass through his hands. And then, the White House. When Sinatra introduced Giancana to John F. Kennedy through their shared connection, Judith Campbell, he thought he was strengthening friendships. Instead, he was walking into a political storm. As the FBI intensified surveillance on organized crime, Sinatra found himself caught in the crossfire. The same government he'd supported now saw him as a liability. His phone was tapped, his friends interrogated, his reputation bleeding in the press. And Giancana, the man who had once called him brother, saw it as betrayal. When Kennedy cut ties with Sinatra to distance himself from scandal, the mob's patience snapped. The favors stopped. The protection vanished. And suddenly, the man with the golden voice was standing on stage alone, wondering which handshake had marked his fall. In those years, Sinatra's temper became legend. He lashed out at reporters, at photographers, even at his own shadow. But deep down, the rage was fear. He had seen too much, owed too many, and trusted too few. Rumors spread that there was a hit out on him, that Giancana wanted him taught a lesson. Nothing was ever proven. But Frank never slept the same again. He left the casino circuit, distanced himself from old friends, and poured his pain into his music. Every lyric, "That's life, my way, it was a very good year," sounded less like confidence and more like confession. "Regrets, I've had a few," but those who listened closely knew. He wasn't singing about women or fame. He was singing about power and what it had cost him. By the time Giancana was found dead in 1975, shot 7 times in his own kitchen, Sinatra's name was nowhere near the investigation. He never spoke publicly about his mob ties again. But whenever someone asked about Sam, he would pause, smile faintly, and change the subject. Because some ghosts are better left undisturbed. Frank Sinatra died a legend, loved by millions, feared by a few, and haunted by the kind of memories that no applause can drown out. He walked away from the mob, but he carried its shadow to his grave. He sang for presidents and criminals alike, and in the end, the applause sounded the same. Dean Martin, the Rat Pack rebel. If Frank Sinatra was the storm, Dean Martin was the calm that followed. Smooth, effortless, untouchable. He was the kind of man who never seemed afraid of anything. To the public, he was the king of cool. That lazy grin, a cigarette dangling from his lips, a glass of whiskey always half full. But Dean's secret was simple. The whiskey was fake, and the smile was armor. Behind the charm and the laughter, Martin was a man who had seen the cost of getting too close to the mob and had decided he wanted out. In the golden years of Las Vegas, the Rat Pack ruled the Strip. Frank Sinatra, Sammy Davis Jr., Peter Lawford, Joey Bishop, and Dean Martin. 5 men who could turn a casino into a circus and make the whole country laugh. But it wasn't just show business. Behind the curtains stood men like Sam Giancana and Tony Accardo, watching every move, counting every dollar. The Rat Pack wasn't just entertainment, it was business. And business in Vegas always meant the mob. Dean had joined the Rat Pack after years of grinding through Hollywood's toughest circuits. nightclub shows, B-movies, endless road gigs. When the Rat Pack exploded, he became a legend overnight. But where Sinatra leaned into power, Dean preferred peace. He didn't like the mob, didn't trust politicians, and hated owing anyone anything. At first, Giancana saw him as an ally, the cool one, the level-headed one. But Dean didn't play the game. He refused favors, ignored invitations to private meetings, and declined to get involved in deals that smelled dirty. When Giancana's men offered him extra protection during shows, Dean famously told them, "If they shoot me, shoot them back. Otherwise, don't bother me." It was charm masking defiance, and the mob didn't take kindly to defiance. Over time, the cracks in the Rat Pack began to show. Frank's temper, Lawford's political scandals, Sammy's complicated relationships, and through it all, Dean's quiet resistance. He showed up late, left early, and refused to take part in Mafia-sponsored appearances. When asked why, he said, "Because I don't like being told what to sing or who to sing for." That was enough to make him a problem. Rumors began spreading that Dean was disrespecting friends, that he was forgetting who made him. But Martin never flinched. He simply smiled, raised his glass, and went home. When the mob realized he couldn't be intimidated, they switched tactics. They froze him out. Casinos where he used to headline quietly stopped booking him. Film offers slowed. Even Sinatra, caught between loyalty and fear, started keeping his distance. To outsiders, it looked like Dean Martin was fading. But in truth, he was doing what no one else had dared. He was walking away. He retreated from Hollywood's chaos and built his own world. Golf, family, and silence. He sang when he wanted to, where he wanted to. And when asked why he had left it all behind, he said, "I'd rather be bored than buried." By the 1980s, the Rat Pack was gone, the mob was fractured, and Dean had become a relic of a more glamorous and more dangerous time. He rarely spoke about the men who had once surrounded him. He didn't need to. His silence was his victory. Dean Martin died peacefully in 1995, in his own bed, something almost no one from his era could claim. But peace came with a price. He spent his last years alone, haunted by memories of the friends he'd buried and the ones he'd left behind. In a business where everyone owed someone, Dean Martin owed no one. He didn't fight the mob with guns or words. He fought it by doing the one thing it couldn't forgive. He ignored it. In a world built on favors and fear, Dean Martin's quiet rebellion was the loudest sound of all. Phyllis McGuire, the woman who loved a mob boss. She had the kind of beauty the camera adored. Perfect posture, angelic smile, a voice smooth as champagne. To America, Phyllis McGuire was one-third of the McGuire sisters, the wholesome singing trio that defined the 1950s. They were elegance, purity, and family charm, the very image of what Hollywood wanted women to be. But behind that polished smile, Phyllis was living a love story that could never make the front page, because the man who held her heart was the most dangerous figure in America. His name was Sam Giancana. By the time Phyllis met him, Giancana was already a legend. The Chicago outfit boss who controlled Las Vegas casinos, rigged elections, and, according to FBI whispers, had connections that reached as far as the White House. He was ruthless, powerful, and magnetic. To the outside world, he was a monster. To Phyllis, he was a mystery she couldn't resist. They met at a private event in Las Vegas in 1959. He sent her roses the next morning, a dozen for her beauty and one more for luck. Soon after, she was seen stepping out of limousines that didn't belong to any Hollywood studio. Their romance was intoxicating. He'd fly her across the country in private jets, shower her with jewels, promise her the world. For a girl raised in conservative Ohio, it was a dream dipped in danger. And like all dreams born in the shadows, it came with a cost. The FBI knew. They wiretapped their phones, photographed their meetings, tracked her every move. She became a liability, not just to Giancana, but to an entire network of men who depended on silence. When reporters began circling, Giancana told her to disappear for a while. She refused. "You can't scare me," she once said to him. "I've already lost the right to be afraid." But she was wrong. Fear wasn't something you lost. It was something you learned to live with. Soon the gossip columns turned cruel. The Maguire sisters' clean image shattered. Concert bookings vanished overnight. The trio disbanded, their golden harmonies silenced by association. Phyllis became a ghost of her former self. Glamorous but exiled, living in a mansion in Las Vegas that Giancana had bought for her, she filled it with mirrors and chandeliers, as if trying to reflect a world that no longer existed. In 1965, Giancana's empire began to crumble. He was called before a federal grand jury in order to testify. He refused and was sent to prison. When he was released, he found his kingdom gone, his allies scattered, and his enemies closing in. Phyllis tried to distance herself, but love doesn't always let go. Even after Giancana's assassination in 1975, 7 bullets to the head in his own kitchen, his ghost lingered in her life. The FBI raided her home, still suspecting she knew more than she ever admitted. She smiled for the cameras, denying everything, repeating the same lines she'd used for years. I loved him. That's all there is. But everyone in that world knew. Love was never all there is. Phyllis Maguire lived until 2020, long after every man who had once defined her life was gone. She never married, never had children, and never escaped the shadow of that affair. In her final interview, when asked about Giancana, she still defended him. He was kind to me, she said softly, and that's the truth I'll keep. Maybe she believed it. Maybe she needed to. Because for Phyllis, like so many before her, the mob wasn't just a force of fear. It was the closest thing she ever had to passion. She had fought for love, not realizing she was fighting the one war no one ever wins. She didn't die for the mob, the narrator would whisper, but she lived for it. And that was worse. They stood up. They spoke out. Some for truth, others for love. But the result was always the same. The mob took everything it couldn't control.